Hello, everyone. Today, we're very happy to welcome Mr. Sean Aylmer to join our program. Sean was a former editorial director of Fairfax Media, with the masthead of Sydney Morning Herald, Financial Review, and The Age we are very familiar with. He now is a host of the Fear and Greed podcast. I'll put a link to the podcast show, and I encourage everyone to follow it. It's a daily run-up of Australian business news. All right, so thank you, Sean, for joining us. Let me start with your background. I understand you are an economist by training. How did you decide to go into journalism?
To be honest, Hannah, I grew up about 4 hours west of Sydney in a place called Orange. And when I was in year 10, I was 16, and you had to go and do a work experience at somewhere local. And I went to the local newspaper, somewhere called Central Western Daily, and I loved it. And I moved to Sydney, went to university, thought I should be I should be an economist because that sounded like a good idea. I was working at the Reserve Bank of Australia at the time, so Australia's central bank. So I kind of went through their training course, became an economist. Truth be known, I wasn't a great economist, and I always wanted to do journalism. Mm-hmm. So I went and did a Masters of Journalism, and then fortunately found my way into business journalism, which is kind of my genre, and worked my way through the Sydney Morning Herald originally, then the Fin Review, and then I kind of went into editing those sorts of newspapers. I was based in New York for about 3 years over there, based in Canberra in the press gallery for a while, reported on banking, economics, politics, all those sorts of things. Eventually, as you said, I became editorial director, and then left there probably 6 or 7 years ago, I'd say. And then, I've been running the podcast for 5 or 6 years, which, as you said, is a business political podcast, comes out every morning. And, journalism is just my thing. That's it.
I've always have this question I want to ask economists is that we always have this narrative promoted by the political parties and by the media. Somehow in Australia, say the Conservative Party, the coalition is always better at running economy than Labor, like Labor always big spender and ruin the economy. But my understanding is we are a free market economy. Isn't that economic cycle largely running on its own without much government influence?
Yes, I mean, in a sense, the answer to that question depends on what side of politics you come from. If you look at Australia's history, probably the great reformist government of the last 40 or 50 years was the Hawke-Keating government, where we floated the dollar, deregulated interest rates, those sorts of things. That was the great sort of economic sort of shift forward, and that was a Labor government. Now, probably the time of our greatest prosperity was Howard Costello. That was a Conservative government. So people say, I mean, Labor governments tend to be bigger spending for sure. And that is the case now. I think we're about heading towards 27-28% of GDP under this current government based on their budget forecasts. That, I think it is 28% of GDP. That would be the highest since World War II. So they're definitely a big spending government, the one we've got. Labor tends to be big spending governments more than Conservatives. But as you say, it's all at the margins a bit because it is a free market economy. And, Australia's fortunes depend very heavily on our trading partners, China being the largest one, Japan being next in line. And, we fortunately, until COVID, we had a 40-year run without a recession. Now, at the margins, the federal government did well on that. The Reserve Bank did well on that. But a lot of that, we should have had recessions, but we sold a lot of iron ore to China, for example, and that kind of got us through there. So that's a very long answer to your question. Broadly, Labor is the biggest spending party, but the economic cycle is probably more important than whoever's in government.
If you look at daily coverage, media coverage about economic issues such as inflation, interest rates, and cost of living, what do you wish the political journalists can understand better about macroeconomics?
Yeah, this is a broad question for journalists. You are throwing a journalist onto a police round or onto economic data or onto a sport often when they have very little knowledge of it. And one of the great skills of a journalist is being able to assimilate knowledge and kind of make it sound sensible. And so you have a podcast or you have a video or you write online and it all sounds sensible. Now, the very best journalists are the ones tend to have been there for a long time, have worked really hard, understood their subject area. And economics is a bit technical, and it is very good when you have sort of people like Ross Gittins, who's probably the doyen of economics journalists in Australia. But there's a bunch of guys like Peter Harcher. They're great journalists because they really do understand it. There are times when you read things, and I kind of read markets reports and investment reports at times from mainstream media, and I think to myself, oh, they just don't understand what they're writing. And so it's a shame that is the case, but it always was. And I think the ones that last are the ones that are good. Mostly, a lot of the economics reporting comes out of Canberra. They're primarily political reporters who understand economics, as opposed to economics reporters who understand politics. So, the reporting may not be as good as you might hope if you're an economics wonk. But, that's not always the case. And certainly there are examples. I mentioned Ross, John Keogh's another guy from the Fin Review. They are seriously good economics reporters.
If you look at especially the tabloid newspapers' coverage of economic issues such as interest rates, it always strikes me as a bit too sensational, like always low interest is good, the increase of interest is bad. But that's oversimplifying the issue, isn't it?
Totally. And look, tabloid newspapers, for want of a better term, tabloid websites, are there to attract viewers, to attract readers. And often what people want to know about the economy is what affects me. And I have a mortgage, so about a third of the population has a mortgage, a third of the people rent, and a third of people have paid it off. So the third that have the mortgage, if interest rates are going up, that's what they care about. If they're going down, that's what they care about. And that tends to be kind of the people that journalists write for. Now, you are 100% right. If I'm a pensioner or a retiree relying on income, so maybe term deposits or bonds or something, and interest rates start going up, I'm getting excited. That's going to increase my fortnightly income or monthly income. So definitely, if I'm traveling overseas, what happens to the exchange rate matters. Like, there's lots of those things which we tend to gloss over. And we just do become more sensational about, rates going up is bad. Now, of course, that's not true. When interest rates are going up, often the economy is going well. So that's a good sign. People have jobs. People can find another job if they don't want one. If you're a small businessman, like yourself, things are going better. And that's true. So like sometimes higher interest rates actually is a good sign for the economy. But just as journalists and tabloid, many tabloid journalists are very good. They know what they're talking about. But if you want a headline and you've got a moment to get someone's attention as they're scrolling and you say interest rates going up, your mortgage is going up, that's what you tend to do.
Okay, let's now turn to a topic that our Chinese Australian audience are very interested in, is that there are some critics in the Chinese Australian community who often claim that, well, this is not limited to Fairfax, but to most of the Australian media, including the Murdoch media and the ABC, that they seem to think that the media coverage of China and the issues involving the Chinese government too biased or too negative towards China and towards their form of government. What's your response to that?
So just park China for a moment. News Corp, Australian, those sorts of organisations certainly have they're centre, but they're with a right-wing tilt. ABC, the old Fairfax, so Fin Review, Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, they're centre with a left-wing tilt. Now, when issues come up, and probably an even better one is actually in the Middle East and what's gone on there, that really does shine through. When it comes to China, the thing about China, I think, is that so many of us misunderstand China. We don't understand the economy properly. We don't understand the culture. We don't understand leadership and how society works and that. So it's very easy to kind of paint, Chinese tariffs on wine is dreadful. Isn't Beijing terrible, right? Without actually understanding what's going on. Now, you tend to have more left-leaning organizations, perhaps a little more generous in their coverage of China, more right-leaning organizations, less generous in their coverage of China. But I would say I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about China. Now, I've been a journalist for 30 years. I've never covered China per se, but I wish I had, because it's kind of the most important country in terms of Australia, in terms of my life every day, what I eat, who I communicate with, what I see. So many people who are Chinese, it's enriched my life, which is great. I realise I just don't know much about it. And I think that's the same with journalists. So there probably is a tilt one way or another, but China's different. You talk about the US, right? And Donald Trump is such a polarizing figure. It's easy kind of to jump on that. Is Xi Jinping or Li Peng, are they polarizing figures? We don't know enough about it to know whether they are or not. Like it's actually quite difficult to know how to think about China.
Would it help if there were more Chinese Australian journalists covering China? It seems to me that there are not enough Australian journalists who are actually with Chinese heritage, who can speak fluently the language and understand the culture and the nuances of the society, who are actually based in China at the moment. There's the only few journalists, Australian journalists in China, are still a Caucasian heritage background.
Yeah, totally agree. Absolutely. Like our journalists should reflect our society. Now, I don't know how much of the 28 million people in Australia have an Asian background, Asian heritage, but, whatever percentage of that should be the percentage of journalists. And it's the same for Europeans, and it's the same for Africans. And of course it's not, because English is, most journalism is written or spoken, and English as a first language is much easier for Anglos than it is for anyone else. And so that's kind of how it transpires. But wouldn't it be great if we could just suddenly say, right, let's get people who truly understand Chinese culture, Japanese culture, I'd say the same thing, Indonesian culture, I'd say the same thing, and train them up to be journalists for us. That would be wonderful.
As a former editorial director at Fairfax, how do you see the print media's future in Australia? It's certainly in decline, but like everywhere else around the world. So is there still a future for print media?
If I'm being perfectly honest, I'm surprised it's still going, print media, not digital. And the mastheads we're talking about, I worked in newspapers for many, many years. I actually have them delivered on a Saturday and Sunday, as you know, and I never open the packages. I don't. I look at everything online. And if someone like me is doing that, then it's only a matter of time where they're diminished potentially to the point of not being around. Now, when I worked at Fairfax and I ran the newsrooms there, we went through all these ideas of maybe we only have a Sunday edition, or only a Saturday and Sunday edition, or the tricky part for all of that, and again, Han, you would know this better than I would. If I'm a news agent and I'm receiving income because I'm delivering papers 7 days a week, right? Well, I want the 7 days a week. If Nine Media or Fairfax or News comes and says, you've got to do it for us 1 day a week, well, it's just not worth the news agent's point. So, I think all that is coming to a head at the moment. And I hate to say it, but I don't think newspapers will be here in 10 years.
Would you agree with conservative criticism that the Sydney Morning Herald and especially the Age are too left-leaning, too tree-hugging and lattice-sitting?
Yeah. It's a really hard question to answer. The Age's audience is more left-leaning, as in the Melbourne establishment plus the Melbourne kind of middle class is more left-leaning, I would argue, than Sydney. And the Age is reporting and writing to its audience, and Sydney Morning Herald is reporting and writing to its audience. It's sometimes journalism isn't a well-paid job, and often you get people who see it as a vocation, as in they're going in because they really believe in what they do. And that's the wonderful thing about journalists, but they're kind of not out there to make $1 million either. And they really do care about the environment, and they genuinely care about what's happening in their backyard and what politicians are doing. And that's exactly what you want. But as a result, you tend to attract people who are more left-leaning. Now, it's easy for me to say that the ABC is too left-leaning, and Sydney Morning Herald and the Age is too left-leaning. The Oz is too right-leaning, and the AFR is, sort of somewhere in the middle. But they're writing to their audience, and their audience appreciates it. What I do want is just the facts and figures. And then if someone's having an opinion, then do that. What I really dislike sometimes, where you get this in the Age and the Herald and the Fin and the Oz, is when there's a mix of reporting and opinion.
Mixed with opinion, yeah.
Yeah, because in the end, you don't know what you're reading, whether it's right or wrong. I want facts, and I want to know that Anthony Albanese, the debate on immigration policy, I want to know what Anthony Albanese says is going to happen on immigration. I want to know what Angus Taylor says is going to happen on immigration. And now if someone else wants to go off and say, hey, in my opinion, Angus Taylor is saying that, we shouldn't take immigrants from the southern Philippines, that's a great idea. That's in that person's opinion. So I'm interested in that, definitely. But I don't want that mixed up with the facts. And if I had a criticism of the Herald and the Age, which was where the question came from, it would be that there is definitely, there can be a bent towards that opinion fact mixing together. And often the opinion is more left-leaning.
There are some estimate that the Murdoch press has about 70% of the market share in the print media in Australia. And the people in the left are always criticize that the Murdoch press has too much influence over Australian politics. Would you agree to that?
So 70% of the print media, whether that's right or wrong, that probably is for the Herald Sun and the Daily Telegraph in Sydney and those papers. That mattered 20 years ago. I actually don't think it matters now. I mean, I went away for the weekend, Han, and we got on the plane, and next to one of the guys I was with, the guy was 30, a woman got on the plane, fell asleep. We got off the plane, my son said, did you see who that was? And I'm just, Tammy someone or other, I can't remember her name, right? I had no idea who she was. I looked her up. She had 16 million followers on Instagram, right?
Yeah, more than the Telegraph combined, yeah.
More than all of newspapers combined, And so, if they've got 70% of the print, well done to them, but it's just nowhere near as influential as, the woman who fell asleep on my friend's shoulder because she has 16 million. Now, it's different. She doesn't have the credibility of the Australian or the Financial Review. I get that. She doesn't have the strict boundaries and the kind of rigor of journalism and all that. But if you're talking about who my kids are taking notice of, it is more like the influencer. Having said all that, the people who are running this country right now, they're business leaders, political leaders, they care what is on the front page of the Australian. They care what's in the Fin. They care. Yep.
They still set the agenda every day.
Yep. And, the radio stations follow what the newspapers do. The TV stations follow that. It's not as much as it was, and ultimately it won't be there. But they do set the agenda because the leaders, the 45, 50-year-olds plus are still keen on seeing their name in lights in one of those organizations. They're still, one of those media outlets, they're still paranoid that, I'm sure this week, as we speak here, the ACCC, the Competition Watchdog has been having a go at Coles. It's going to have a go at Woolies in the next couple of months. It's about whether or not there's, what a discount is and how that's defined. I guarantee you, people at Coles are hating this because all the media outlets are talking about it. Now, social media is not talking about it. They might get onto it eventually. But they are significant because important people read them, but 10 years' time, they'll be much less significant.
So as you predict the decline of commercially run print media, would it be more important to have ABC, the public broadcaster, so more funding for it? Because journalism, publicly funded journalism, it might be the only way to go forward to provide still much needed independent journalism, or is ABC too much a drain on the public purse, as the conservatives like to complain?
That is such a hard question. It's such a hard question. I go through cycles with the ABC where I can't stand having anything to do with it, and other times I love it because sometimes I think they're lecturing me and stop lecturing me, just present the facts. And so I really, the ABC is an incredible organization, does incredible work, has been able to stay with the news cycle and the different mediums used and all that. It's done an amazing job. If we're a bigger country like US, you wouldn't need the ABC. So if you go to the US, you have a free press, you have groups like sort of independent news organizations, from the online organizations through to the New Yorker and the Atlantic and those sorts of magazines. They do that job. Maybe in Australia, because we're too small, we do need the ABC. But that is like, I have wrestled with that question, I reckon, for 30 years while I've been a journalist. And when I was a journalist, I was frustrated because why is the public, like, I was in a private sector organization trying to get the best stories, working. My company was trying to make money, and we're up against the ABC, which was being, sort of handed all its money from the government, which was actually my money, my taxpayer money. So, like, it was actually quite frustrating. I found the ABC, but it has magnificent journalists and does great work. So, I don't know. I'm talking in circles. I don't have an answer to that because I can't decide myself.
But should it have hire more conservative voices? I mean, personally, I'm left-leaning, but I do think that they need to have more balanced conservative voices because conservative pay at least half of the taxes into them to fund ABC. So they should have better representation in terms of the voices and opinions aired through the program, do they?
Yes. I mean, I would say if you took all journalists across the country and 0 was left, 10 was right, then most journalists are 3 or 4. All right. So on that left side. And therefore, if that's a pool of people you're taking from, no matter what your organization is, you're going to end up taking from that style of person. I think the ABC absolutely has to reflect society. And I agree that it reflects a certain segment of society. You said, Han, you're left-leaning, and you find that it is too left-leaning. Therefore, you can imagine what the right-leaning people think of the ABC, and they let us know about it too. Yeah. And, so I mean, I think that is a fair criticism, really challenging one to get your head around, though, and actually solve too, because, what people who are the 6 or 7 on my spectrum, right, who are right-leaning journalists, they necessarily going to go to the ABC? We probably don't get paid as much, to be perfectly honest. Don't know. Probably not.
Yeah. Okay. Let's turn our attention to politics. How do you assess the current situation of the coalition opposition found itself in? Is One Nation set to take over as the major conservative party in Australian politics?
So no, I think One Nation is peaking right now. The coalition is shambolic. It's a shocker. And the fact that the coalition has, the Federal National Party and Liberal Party have broken up twice, the fact that the opinion polls have One Nation in front of the combined National and Liberal Party, the fact that they've just gotten rid of Susan Lee, absolutely shambolic. Having said, and what's really important is whether you are left or right, you need a good opposition. Because at the moment, Albanese and friends are doing whatever they want because there's no opposition. And whoever's in government needs a strong opposition to actually pass good legislation. One of the few times Australia's had a minority government with Julia Gillard a few years ago, and she was a great negotiator. She had a strong opposition. They passed a lot of legislation, the NDIS being the biggest one, very much, as a collaborative group of people arguing the toss over what's best for Australians. Now, at the moment, we don't, because Labor can do what they want, to be perfectly honest. They in the House of Reps, they've got a majority. In the Senate, they need the Greens' help, but they tend to, the bits of legislation that's passed so far, they've been able to get the Greens' help. The stuff after the Bondi massacre is slightly different because the coalition obviously split over that, and some of the coalition did support Labor on that. Point in all this, you need a strong opposition, whoever it is. Now, One Nation and Pauline Hanson, Barnaby Joyce have been having a fantastic time of it. Good on them. But Angus Taylor hasn't got someone breathing down his neck because Susan Lee is leaving Parliament. He has already started talking in recent days about immigration, about cost of living, and cost of living is a really important, all politics, especially right now around the globe. I just think they'll be a lot stronger, and that will detract from One Nation. So the idea that One Nation could become Australia's alternate government to Labor, I think is a fallacy. I think this is its peak time, and it's done a good job, One Nation, by getting Barnaby Joyce particularly, in growing its cohort. But I don't think it will improve much from here. Now, having said that, Han, you get me on in 6 months' time, and you're saying, so do you think Pauline Hanson really will be Prime Minister? I could be proven 100% wrong, but I don't think so. I think the coalition, the Federal Nats and Libs will work together better. And One Nation, it won't fade. It'll always have a great kind of supporter base, but it won't be getting 26% in the opinion polls as it has in the last couple of opinion polls.
Isn't the Liberals in a no-win situation where they, on the one hand, they have to emulate One Nation's hard right policies to cater to the conservative voter who are unsatisfied with the status quo, but on the other hand, the more they take on One Nation's policies, the more alienating they are to the metropolitan soft liberal voters who might turn their vote to teal candidates, which is already happening. For example, in our own Bradfield, for the first time in history, the Liberals have lost to the teal candidate. So the Liberals are in a no-win situation here, isn't it?
It's not a no-win situation. I agree with what you just said then. So the sort of small L Liberals, the socially progressive Liberals, they have lost out to the teals. And I think there's
Malcolm Turnbull kind of Liberals, right?
Yeah. And then One Nation is picking at the other side. I think liberal traditions conservative traditions, and as we call them, Liberal Party here, which is a bit of a misnomer, they need to get back to the basics. The economy is a big one, and Angus Taylor has said that. They can, so immigration is a good example. So Pauline Hanson basically saying, close the borders to certain types of people. Don't let them in. What Angus Taylor has said is, well, we need to be wary of some people where they come from, but let's have that debate and work out where we're going, which is kind of a much better positioning for the coalition. I mean, it's a positioning to begin with, but it's better positioning for the coalition and for the Liberals to not be as far right as One Nation and offer an alternate on that particular issue. On the economy, he's talking about lowering taxation. He said, I'll take lower taxes to the next election. Real Liberal Party policy. Mainstream Australia likes that sort of thing. They like to hear about that. Another thing that he's talked about is, I'm going to get the phrase, it was nanny. And so universal childcare is something that the federal government has introduced under Albanese, extremely expensive. And he's saying, well, we think kids should have childcare, but there should be choice. Parents should have more choice about it. and this is how we'll do it. Like, so he's kind of picking a much better middle road than his predecessor Susan Lee did, much more reasonable than One Nation. And even some of those Teal voters, I mean, if they could stick to this, some of those Teal voters could well come back around. So in short, we need a strong opposition. I'm not for or against Angus Taylor or for or against Susan Lee, but the fact that Susan Lee always had Angus Taylor breathing down her neck, Angus Taylor doesn't have that. He's starting to formulate policies which are more sort of, he's a conservative, right? A conservative liberal, but some of his policies are kind of shifting a little bit to the left on that. And I think that's probably a good thing for the country.
Should the Liberals adjust their stance on China? Because one of the key reason the Liberal lost the election last time is, for example, in our own Bradfield, there is a significant portion of Chinese Australian voters, like about a quarter actually. So we are one of the biggest Chinese Australian electorate in the country. And the Chinese Australian voters, from what I understand, are extremely concerned, worried about Peter Dutton's rhetoric on China, because he talks about war a lot. And even though many Chinese Australian voters are naturally conservative voters, small c conservatives, but in the normal circumstance, I think they tend to vote Liberal. But in the last election, they were so concerned about the frequent talk of war with China, and also the Chinese spy talk by Jane Hume, for which she later apologized. It's alienated a lot of the Chinese-speaking voters, and it isn't time for the Liberal to rethink their strategy and their policy stance on China, because after all, it is our biggest trading partner, and we need to be more pragmatic with our policy towards China, right?
Maybe you're right, Han. Maybe you're not. I think if they want to win government and 25% of this seat that we're in Bradfield is Chinese background, then, you know, and this has never been lost by the Conservatives until the last election, right? Then that will force them to rethink how they think about their relationship with China. China's a vexed issue for Australia. And at the end of the day, there's two great superpowers now. Maybe there's a third in Russia, but I don't think so. There's really two great superpowers. And our greatest trade friend is China. And our greatest political friend was the US. I'm not sure that's still the case now. So for treading that line is challenging. Scott Morrison, the Conservative Prime Minister, very happy to blame China for COVID, and China retaliated, right? That's what you get, and I'm not for or against what China did there. I'm just saying that's the world of geopolitics.
They are doing what they see in their national interest.
Totally. Anthony Albanese clearly thought in our national interest was tone that down. China thought it's in its national interest to trade and be friendlier to Australia. And I think that's good. Like, I do think that's a really good, better situation to be in. I don't know the answer. I don't know whether, because you could argue that, well, Labor is definitely friendlier towards China than the Conservatives. So as a voter, I can choose which one I want. And so if I want Australia to be friendlier to China and relations to be stronger, then I vote Labor. If I don't want that, I can vote Conservative. Now, of course, we vote on a bunch of things, right? Lots of reasons you vote. But one of my kids was voting for the Liberal Party candidate because she said that she was going to renovate the Chatswood rugby change rooms. That's what mattered to him. So there are all these issues, and it depends. And I'm sure the Chinese community, the relationship between Australia and China really, really matters. And maybe that is where the Libs have to rethink. But I'm not going to tell people kind of how to vote or how they should think about it.
I guess if I can offer any free advice to the Liberals is to copy what Anthony Albanese is doing, the Labour what is doing, because on the one hand, they tone down the rhetoric towards China. On the other hand, they are continuing with the AUKUS program, so which is China is firmly against, because they see there's a potential strategic risk to China. So basically, the Liberal just need to do what the Labour is doing right now. So speak softly, but carry a big stick. And I mean, Labour copied the coalition immigration policy, the boat policy basically, and it's neutralized the issue. So maybe that's what the Liberals should do, just to neutralize this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really want to give anyone advice on what they should or shouldn't do. It's certainly not politicians, but they should reflect the electorate. And if it's a big enough issue for the electorate, and we have so many Chinese people of Chinese ethnicity in this country, then, you know, just to actually say we don't want to deal with China seems like badness to me.
Okay, let's move on to the topic of the United States, because you were based in New York for a few years. What do you think is the biggest structural difference between Australia and China in terms of our electoral system? Because it seems to me in the US, money is a big influencer in politics. They cost a lot of money to run elections there and to run campaigns. But here in Australia, we have, for example, Clive Palmer did spend hundreds of millions of dollars in advertising campaign, and in the end with zero outcome for him. So it looks quite different, the role of money in politics here in Australia compared to the United States.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think Clive Palmer's policies no one liked, and so he spent more than anyone else and got dumped. I mean, I think one of the big differences between the two countries is that the US president is seen as almighty, all powerful, and there's not really an opposition. I mean, there's a Congress, and, you know, sort of, that's made up of the houses, and they have to vote on issues. Well, we thought they did, but these executive orders that Donald Trump seems to bring out means that he can circumvent those things. In Australia, there's much more of an opposition all the time, and this is going back to our previous point. It's good that the coalition have got themselves together, because at least we have an opposition to take Anthony Albanese on. The US just don't seem to have that as much. The Californian Governor Gavin Newsom is potentially one, but I always thought that was the big difference in terms of the money. Like, both sides raise huge amounts of money, and if you run through the candidates who have, so there's a guy called Ross Perot
in the
30 years,
yeah,
right, 30 years. Yeah. He was a billionaire. He didn't ever make it. Trump made it not because he was a billionaire, but because he captured the right. If you go through Clinton and Obama, and Bush was the Bushes were fairly wealthy, I think. But, you know, certainly, you know, Reagan and Jimmy Carter and that, none of them have been mega rich people. They've just been in the party system, and the party has been able to raise a lot of money for them. None of them have been poor, to my knowledge. I'd have to double check whether that's the case or not. But, you know, they're middle to upper class people in terms of socioeconomic background. And that's, so, you know, the money, what they've done is got the Democrats, the Republican machine behind them, and raised huge amounts of money. People have raised huge amounts of money, and you know, put it towards presidential campaigns. I'm not sure that Trump outspent Kamala Harris / Joe Biden that much. It's just that he grabbed the imagination. He just did a much better job of electioneering. And when you have someone like Clive Palmer, I think people just thought he was a bit of
a joke.
Joke? Is that what you said? You were being nicer than I was home. You were being nicer than I was going to say. But yeah, people just didn't like his policies. And, you know, he threw a lot of money and didn't get one seat.
Is it a credit to our voting system, where we have compulsory voting and preferential voting, that we don't have to spend so much money turning out the votes like they do in the United States? And that's a credit to our system, is it? So maybe the US...
Yeah, totally. I mean, I remember being there for a US election, and it was Bush getting re-elected, George W. Bush getting re-elected. So that must have been 2004, I think.
Yeah.
And going to a polling booth, because I thought this would be interesting. I was reporting for the Financial Review at the time in New York, and no one was there. You know, there were a few people there lined up, and it really staggered me. And I thought, God, how lucky are we in Australia that we have compulsory vote? I mean, we don't actually have compulsory voting. We have compulsory turning up to vote.
Yeah.
So you turn up to vote, and then you're given your sheet of paper, and you can just throw it away. You don't have to vote if you don't want to, but you've got to turn up. And so mostly when you turn up, you decide to actually vote. And it's a wonderful thing. I think preferential voting is a wonderful thing. Now, someone listening here would have lots of arguments why I'm wrong on that, but I like it.
Well, so Nigel Farage is heavily favored to be the next UK PM because they don't have preferential voting there, right? So first past the post, and the Farage might be possible to get past the threshold. But here in Australia, with our system, do you think it's possible? Is it true that it's less likely for Pauline Hanson to be the country's leader because of our preferential vote? Because there are so many more people who don't want her to be the prime minister, so they will rather park their second preference vote somewhere else rather than the One Nation.
Yeah, exactly right. So I might vote Labor, and they've got three options. There are four options: Labor, Greens, One Nation, and Conservatives. So I might go, okay, I go Labor 1, Greens 2, Conservatives 3, Pauline Hanson 4. Under preferential voting, she has no chance in that. And my preference probably ends up going to Conservatives. There's no way Pauline Hanson will ever be Prime Minister of Australia because of preferential voting. It's nearly impossible for an extreme party to do that. Farage, I don't know much about the UK system. It's kind of fascinating what's going on there, and Keir Starmer's hanging on by sort of by a thread. But I don't really understand the system well enough to make much of a comment on the UK, I've got to say.
I'll return to the US topic. You are an economic journalist, so how do you assess the possible outcome of the US High Court's ruling on the tariff thing? Because it seems to me just like a common sense question. The president doesn't have power over levying taxes, right? It's supposed to be Congress. So Trump's tariff policy is basically based on a very false reading of the Constitution of the presidential power, executive power.
Yeah, so he's arguing, I'm going to get it wrong, so it may be the wrong act, but what he's arguing, he's not arguing what you're saying. He's saying he needs emergency powers because
it's emergency.
Yeah, I mean, the country's been at war effectively, or it's only even been used at war before, and he's saying, well, it's a trade war, therefore we are at war. Therefore, I should have these emergency powers and I should be able to unilaterally impose tariffs. We haven't heard from the Supreme Court on that. We've had oral arguments. We will hear from them in the next couple of months about what they think of that. If they strike tariffs down, then who knows what Trump will do. And it's quite possible they will strike it down. It's not like you've got to give some credit to the Supreme Court. I know Trump basically appointed most of them, or not most of them, appointed 3 or 4 of them. There is a conservative bias, I get that, but they're still, jurists, and I think there is a real chance that they do vote that down. And remember, what Trump is doing is using laws from many years ago to run the country the way he wants to. Mostly they will be judged in court, whether they hold up or not. And I think you have to have some faith in the American system in that.
So he has been threatening tariffs up and down to lots of countries and causing the financial market to go up and down, to fluctuate a lot. Isn't that a risk to the market and to the confidence of the market in the economy?
Totally. And you've seen that the US market did really well until the end of last year. And then this year, the tech sector this year, for example, the Magnificent Seven are down 6 or 7%. The S&P 500, the main equity index on Wall Street, is flat. I think we're up 2.5 to 3%. Europe is up more than that. Investors are now moving on all this uncertainty that comes with tariffs and moving their money away from the US. The thing about tariffs is, they haven't been the disaster that everyone predicted, but US consumers are definitely paying the price of tariffs. So too are Chinese exporters to the US as well. But the load is being shared around. But undoubtedly, this uncertainty, all that sort of thing, it's a real turn off for financial markets.
And is there a serious risk of corruption and market manipulation if someone in Trump's inner circle or in his family knew a few hours beforehand about his decision on tariff? They can short the market, right?
There's always a risk of insider trading. Yeah, there's always a risk of insider trading, without a doubt. And if that happens, I hope the person gets caught and gets thrown into jail. But that's not unique to Donald Trump. That's unique to any government in Australia, in the US, in China, anywhere really.
As a business journalist, how do you assess the situation where Trump, while being president in office, also has a billion-dollar business under his name, simultaneously running? That's quite unprecedented in history and creates such a huge risk of conflict of interest, is it, especially in the crypto sector?
Yeah, and it's hard to defend this one because it looks like Donald Trump and family, from an outsider's point of view, it looks like they're taking advantage of the office of presidency to make money. So the meme coin, Trump dollar, for example, that went through the roof when he was first elected. I think it's lost about 70% of its value since its peak of about 12 months ago. So it's come right back. The Melania meme coin, same deal there. That's not worth very much now. So, someone's made money and lost money on that one. The reported deals between Trump enterprises and foreign powers, that's very concerning. I don't know the ins and outs of it, because I can't say whether it's right or wrong. And, you can get into an echo chamber and hear all you want about how wrong Trump is, or you can get into an echo chamber saying, well, none of it matters. But from afar, I would agree with you, Han, it looks dreadful. And whoever's president of the US should be looking after the people of the US, not after themselves.
Can you imagine if the Australian Prime Minister is simultaneously running a family business and issuing crypto meme coin? That's he will be. Well, we don't have impeachment. He will be like how do you say? He will be deposed as leader straight away. Is it in the party room?
Yeah, so Kevin Rudd was a very wealthy Prime Minister of Australia, because his wife, Theresa, she ran that business, and basically they had to put that business on hold while he was Prime Minister, and she stopped running it. So it wasn't just him; it was her as well. She went to arm's length, and none of us expect our Prime Minister to get rich being Prime Minister. And it's wrong if he or she does. And, I totally agree with that.
So isn't that a structural problem of the United States political system? Because I presume when the Constitution was set up 200 years ago, they haven't imagined someone like Trump being so brazen or so audacious in its view of power and money. They have always assumed there will be enough structural balance from the elites or from Congress or from the courts or from the Electoral College to actually filter out candidates like Trump. But they lack imagination in the end, right? They haven't imagined people like Trump will take advantage of the system.
Yeah, I think the US Constitution's held up pretty well over centuries. It's full of checks and balances, and there's a judicial system, and this is back to the Supreme Court question, who will judge whether what Trump's doing is right or wrong, and we should let that play through. From an outsider's point of view, when we look in, it looks bad, without a doubt, and you think, how can they allow this to happen? But the Constitution has checks and balances. It has a judicial system, and I think we have to let that play out first. Now, he's not so Jimmy Carter, 1976 to 1980, a peanut farmer from Georgia. if you want to have odd people being presidents of the US, I reckon Jimmy Carter's more odd than Donald Trump. Donald Trump, is a capitalist trying to make money. Jimmy Carter was a peanut farmer who became a born-again Christian and seemed to rule based on, kind of his Christianity on one side, his hard work probably on the other. And he was an odd bloke. And, in the end, they had I'm going to forget all my details here, but the Iranian embassy hostages, and that was a disaster for him. He lost the election. Reagan took over. He's the sort of guy who's a better former president than he ever was a president. But my point in this story is he was a very odd character, much odder than Donald Trump, to be perfectly honest, to be running the country. And, I think the Constitution has actually held up pretty well. Now, if the Supreme Court let Donald Trump do whatever he wants to do without any checks or balances, then it has failed. Without a doubt, it has failed. But we're not quite there yet.
Not yet. Just a side question. You mentioned the Trump's crypto business. What's your view as a business podcast host of the crypto thing? Is it a futuristic payment system, revolutionary system, or it's just old-fashioned Ponzi scheme?
It's not a Ponzi scheme. It is revolutionary. It will change payment systems, but I don't fully understand the value in it. So some of the technology behind it will change payment systems. So that it's much better than a Ponzi scheme. But the value of Bitcoin depends on supply and demand. And we've been through periods where Bitcoin's today worth $67,000 US a unit, $68,000 US a unit, was $129,000 US a unit. When you have these huge disparities, that's not really it's not a currency. It's not the same as the Aussie dollar or the US dollar. It's not the same as gold or anything like that. It's a speculative asset that has got these incredible properties, particularly in the back end, blockchain technology. So it certainly has a good to it, but I don't understand the value. I mean, that's just the market supply and demand thing. And that's the part which I think is a bit random.
Okay, Donald Trump has frequently attacked the Federal Reserve. He wants them to always lower interest rate. Of course, he was a real estate tycoon. So, real estate developer always want low interest rate. But doesn't that risk undermining the independence of the central bank of the entire U.S., the basis of which the entire U.S. financial credit system is based on?
Yes. Simple answer to that. You need an independent Federal Reserve. If it had gone and cut interest rates as much as Donald Trump had wanted, it would have out of control inflation, and we would have had a share market crash as a result. We would have business, if not now, we would be starting to see lots of business closures. That's if the Fed had done exactly what Donald Trump had asked. So the Fed being independent is critical. You saw that a few weeks ago when Trump announced Walsh is his name. Walsh is the guy's name. Is going to be the Fed chair when the current guy steps down. The current guy's name is Jerome Powell. He stood up to Donald Trump, in spite of everything. When that guy was appointed, he's actually a fairly, considered person. And so you actually saw stock markets rise because Donald Trump didn't put someone he wanted in necessarily, or just someone who would do what he said. He put someone with some gravitas, and then that's why you saw stock markets rise. Independent central banks are critical. And if you want to throw your economy down the toilet, well, take away the independence of your central bank.
Well, that leads to our next question. How do you think the U.S. media should cover Trump? Because traditionally, when the political media covers a political figure, president, you use the both sides story, right? So some claim this, and critics will claim that. But with Donald Trump, he is a quite unique figure because he is unconventional. He makes outlandish claims and often contested claims, or some would even suggest as completed fabrications. For example, he will say Mexico will pay for the border wall, foreign country will pay for the tariff, or the most recent strange comment that China will end ice hockey in Canada with their new partnership with Canada. I don't know what exactly is he talking about. How do you think, as an editor yourself, how should media cover people like Trump, who are very good at capture attention, but always promote outlandish claims, disputed claims, unlike many other presidents who are quite cautious at making such claims?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. There are some organizations like CNN in the US, which will always take a negative view on Trump. There are organizations like Fox News, which will always take a positive view on Trump. If you look at CBS, NBC, many of those organizations, they're trying to track the middle road. When you're being bullied by Trump, that's really difficult. What you see now, and if you read the New York Times, it's kind of interesting. They've stopped being amazed by his outlandish statements. They've stopped reporting on a lot of the stuff he says, which is just totally ridiculous. And I think the shock factor of Trump is wearing off a bit, and that's a good thing, because in the end it comes down to policy and what's going on. You know, in the US, immigration obviously is a really big one. I think the cost of living and how people are, you know, paying their day-to-day bills, I think we're going to see a lot more of that, and Trump's promising tax cuts on that. It's really hard to cover someone like Trump without just saying, oh my God, did you see what he said today? He's crazy, you know, and people like seeing it. But I think after a year of it, people are getting a bit tired of it, and you can get it on your social media feed, that's fine. But a lot of the mainstream media in the US are actually slowing or just not reporting the sensational stuff about Trump as much as they used to. Having said that, you can go to Fox News, you go to CNN, you get whatever side of politics you want, no problems. But I do feel for the mainstream media, because, you know, they asked Donald Trump a question and they say, where are you from? And they said ABC News, or ABC fake news. You know, like, it's very hard to operate.
The other day, I think there was a CNN journalist who asked Trump about the question about Epstein files, and he shot back at her that you're not smiling enough or something like that, insulting her. But so that's raised me this question: why would other journalists allow this to happen? Shouldn't the fellow journalists at the same press conference follow up with the same question about Epstein file? But it seems to me that the journalists are not doing their job by not following up, because politicians hate follow-up questions, right? If you look at I think I like the British way of questioning the politician, the program like Hard Talk. They keep focusing on one question, and they will not stop until the politician gave them an answer. But in the US, it seems to me the problem with covering Trump is the journalists are not following up, not pursuing their question enough. They let Trump go with a lot of the falsehood.
I think you've got to be a bit more generous to the journalists. There could be 100 people trying to ask Donald Trump a question. He's got 15 minutes. You get one question, he abuses you because he doesn't like the question, and then he says next, you know, and there is no follow-up. And if you're a journalist and you're reporting for the New York Times, and the next person is reporting for Tech Daily and wants to know about AI, and someone else is reporting about, you know, the car manufacturers of Detroit and want to know about what he thinks of EVs. And so occasionally, you know, you get a one-on-one and you see Trump getting to real arguments. There's been 60 Minutes interviews with that, where that's happened. But mostly there's
Jonathan Swan, the Australian journalist who was very good at pursuing Trump in detailed question. Remember Jonathan Swan? He's the son of...
Jonathan had an interview with Trump in his first 4-year period, and one of my great memory of that was Jonathan, who I used to work with many years ago. Trump answering a question, and Jonathan's eyes going, "You're lying! What are you like?" He just couldn't believe he was saying, he was hearing what he was. But most people don't get that one-on-one time with Donald Trump, and all those things that you see, and he's calling, you know, telling women to smile more, or calling them piggy, or saying your organization's fake news, it's not like they've got a second shot to come back either. Like it generally, it's the way it's set up, to be honest. So it's very, very challenging for the journalists over there. And I think if you've got a one-on-one, but even if you get a one-on-one, Donald Trump will attack you, and belittle you. And you've seen people stand up to him, but it's very difficult to do. Very difficult to do. And most people just don't have the opportunity. So I don't think it's on the journalists for not asking follow-up questions, to be honest.
Okay, well, I guess this is our last question. We going on a similar topic. So Trump's political style is involved sharp, personalized insults. We even categorize insults. So how do U.S. media should treat that as a matter of tone or style, or as something that requires a different kind of coverage? I mean, you mentioned that a lot of the media, like the New York Times, have stopped covering the sensational part of his outlandish claim. But isn't that run the risk of sane-washing Donald Trump? Because he's the president, the thing he mentioned or he posted on Truth Social are reflective of his own thinking. And if they are nonsense or outlandish, they should be covered because that reflect the way of thinking of the president of the United States. We shouldn't sane-wash that, shouldn't we?
Yeah, I agree with all that, Han, but the president of the United States at the moment can say 5 things in 15 minutes on Truth Social. Each, if it was from anyone else, would end up with 5 days of discussions. Each single one would end up with 5 days of discussions. He's doing 5 in 15 minutes, right? And you have to sift through a lot of that. If you take the Greenland stuff, how much has been written? How much angst has that caused? It's no closer to fruition than it ever was. And there's the whole taco thing. Trump always chickens out, on tariffs. He said he's going to put huge tariffs. It was going to put 50% on China. Then he reduced it. Then he increased it. Like, it's totally irrational at times. And you have to kind of work your way through that. And, in financial markets, they say, don't listen to the noise, listen to the facts. And the thing about Donald Trump, he gives you so much stuff that isn't fact that it's hard sometimes to get rid of it and get to the facts. Of course, you risk what you're talking about. If you're not reporting that stuff, well, what if it's true? But there's only, when you have someone as outrageous as Donald Trump, there's only so much you can report, to be perfectly honest.
Well, I guess that's how he wins 2 terms, is it? Because he puts out so much stuff that in the end people got tired of covering it.
Yeah, maybe. I'm pleased I'm not covering him because I think it'd be really hard to cover as a journalist. Yeah.
Well, all right. I guess at least we're glad here in Australia we don't have a candidate like that. He's quite a unique character.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, I think Clive Palmer tried to be him, but he lacks the charisma of Donald Trump.
Fair enough.
All right. Thanks very much. I think that covers all of topics. It's great to have your insight from your experience as an editor.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right. Thanks very much. We'll keep in touch. Bye-bye.